The sun didn't shine on the day they married. It hid behind a sheet of dull, swollen clouds, as if even the sky disapproved of the county's newest arrangement. The wind carried dust across the courthouse steps, rattling window shutters and brushing against the boots of the townsfolk who gathered not out of joy, but curiosity, judgment, and gossip. Every whisper felt like a thorn in the air. Taza stood at the front of the small courthouse, shoulders squared, face unreadable. He was a tracker known for his quiet competence and unshakable calm. People rarely heard him speak unless necessary. They respected his skill, but not all respected him. The drought had everyone anxious, and tensions between settlers and the Apache community had been rising like the temperature. The county council wanted a gesture, something symbolic to soothe tempers and promise cooperation. So they forced a marriage. Taza had been approached 3 weeks earlier by Councilman Norris, a man who carried his authority like a badge he polished daily. Norris explained it as a union of peace, though the tone he used sounded more like an order. Taza had listened silently, jaw tight, when Norris presented the name of the intended bride, Eleanor Briggs. The 32-year-old schoolteacher, long declared an old maid by those who had nothing better to talk about. Eleanor had received the news in her neat little schoolhouse, chalk on her fingertips and disbelief in her eyes. She had no living family to stand up for her, no husband, no fiancé. Her brother had moved east years ago and never looked back. The council saw her as the easiest choice, a woman with no one to defend her. No one to bargain on her behalf, but she was no meek creature. She had stared down Councilman Norris with a steadiness that shook him more than she intended. "You can force me to marry," she'd said, "but you cannot force me to bow." It was the kind of sentence that became a whispering legend among her students by the next sunrise. Now, on the courthouse steps, she approached in a simple blue dress. No lace, no ribbons. Her hair was pinned neatly, though a rebellious strand danced across her cheek in the wind. People nudged each other as she passed. There she is. Poor thing. Well, what did she expect, refusing every suitor she had? But she ignored them all, chin lifted with the dignity of a queen walking toward a throne she never asked for. Taza watched her ascend the steps. Their eyes met briefly, hers calm but blazing, his dark and steady like a storm building behind mountains. They had spoken only once prior, a short conversation in which she told him she didn't blame him, and he responded with a low, "This wasn't your choice either." The judge cleared his throat, tapping his gavel against his palm as if unsure whether the ceremony counted. The rings were plain. The vows were short. Eleanor's voice did not tremble once, and though Taza spoke only the required words, something in the way he said, "I do," hinted at acceptance rather than surrender. When the judge declared them husband and wife, no one clapped. A couple of women sighed dramatically. A few men exchanged smirks. The air felt tight, suffocating, like a rope pulled around something fragile. Eleanor extended her hand first. It surprised Taza not because she offered it, but because her gesture carried no reluctance, only resolve. He took it gently, aware of every eye studying their touch. Her hand was cool, soft, but strong in its grip, as if she meant to tell him silently, "I will not be your burden, and I will not be their entertainment." He understood her message more deeply than she knew. The council announced that the newlyweds would live in the small ranch house on the far edge of town-neutral ground. Neutral land, neutral everything. Eleanor nodded, accepting her fate with composed grace. Taza inclined his head once to the elders who had come from his community to witness the union. Their expressions were mixed, some approval, some pity, some caution. As the crowd dispersed, the clouds finally broke, not into sunshine, but into a rolling thunder that echoed across the plains. It seemed almost symbolic, two people bound together under pressure not of their making. stepping into a storm neither had chosen. Yet as they walked toward the waiting wagon side by side, not touching, not speaking, Taza noticed something remarkable about the woman he'd been forced to marry. Eleanor Briggs did not walk like someone defeated. She walked like someone preparing to change the course of her own destiny. Even if she had to bend the whole county to do it. The ranch house they'd been given stood on the wide, wind-swept plain like a stubborn survivor, weather-beaten wood. A sagging porch rail, windows clouded with dust. It was neither charming nor welcoming, but it was theirs. Or rather, the county's idea of neutral space. Close enough for people to keep an eye on them. Far enough that no one could hear what they said inside. The first days passed in a hush, so complete that even the floorboards seemed to creak more softly, as if unwilling to disturb the uneasy peace between its new inhabitants. Taza rose before the sun each morning, slipping out with quiet steps. He didn't announce where he was going or when he would return. Sometimes he came back with a bundle of firewood, sometimes with a rabbit or quail for supper, sometimes with nothing but the smell of cedar and pine in his hair and the dust of long miles on his boots. Eleanor didn't ask questions, It wasn't out of fear, it was out of respect. She knew what it felt like to have people pry into her life, to dig at her choices, to treat her like a curiosity. If Taza wanted silence, she would give him that space until he chose otherwise. She spent her mornings tidying the house, cleaning the soot-blackened stove, sweeping out dust devils that snuck inside through the warped door frame. It was a humble home, but she worked with quiet determination to make it livable. She found a faded set of curtains tucked in a drawer and washed them, hanging them to dry on the line. She discovered a stack of abandoned books with cracked spines and placed them neatly on a shelf. She patched a tear in the old horse blanket and fixed the hinge on the back door. None of these were things the county had forced her to do. Yet she did them anyway, because she refused to let her life-forced marriage or not be something she simply endured. Still, the silence between them lingered. Taza rarely spoke during meals. He ate with calm, efficient movements, his gaze drifting between the window and the table. Eleanor tried once to break the quiet, offering, "The house is sturdier than it looks." He'd nodded politely but said nothing more. She wasn't offended. She sensed there were layers to him, carefully guarded, shaped by years of listening more than speaking. Instead of pushing, she adjusted. When she cooked, she prepared food with both of their heritages in mind. Simple stews, roasted rabbit, fresh bread when she managed to trade for flour. She noticed he liked meals with fewer spices and more herbs. She noticed he ate slowly, thoughtfully. He noticed things too. He noticed how she kept the house warm even when the wind howled. How she never wasted a scrap of food. How she carried herself with an unshakable steadiness that reminded him of women from his own community, those who had learned to anchor their lives against the unpredictable world. But even with these quiet observations, there remained a distance between them, a canyon carved by circumstance. The townsfolk didn't help. Every time Eleanor went into town for supplies, she felt their stares prickling her skin. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men pretended not to watch, though their eyes followed her from the general store to the post office to the hitching post. She won't last the winter out there with him. He'll tire of her soon enough. She's too old to give him what a wife should. They should have picked a younger bride. Their words rolled through. Town like dry tumbleweeds, light, careless, but capable of cutting when they hit the right angle. Eleanor never showed a hint of hurt. She kept her shoulders straight, her steps confident. But inside, their words stung not because she believed them, but because they underestimated her so completely. They treated her as though she were fragile, breakable, a footnote in someone else's story. One afternoon, As she returned home with a sack of potatoes and a spool of thread, she saw Taza repairing a loose board on the porch. The sight startled her not because he was working, but because he was working on their house, not simply passing through it. He straightened when he noticed her. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither looked away. She could read nothing in his expression and everything. A flicker of acknowledgement, a quiet respect, maybe even gratitude. It wasn't affection. Not yet, but it was a beginning. Inside the house that evening, the silence felt different, no longer heavy, but cautious, like two storms circling the same horizon, searching for a path that wouldn't destroy them both. Eleanor sat at the table, needle in hand, mending a tear in her skirt. Taza sat across from her, fletching an arrow. A lantern glowed between them, soft and golden. They did not speak, but for the first time, the silence felt shared, not divided. And sometimes, shared silence is the first step toward something far greater. The storm rolled in without warning, an angry, heaving mass of clouds that swallowed the last of the evening light. The air turned sharp with the smell of rain and something else, unease. Eleanor sensed it before the first thunderclap. A teacher's intuition, perhaps, or simply the instinct of a woman who had learned to read trouble long before it arrived. Taza wasn't home yet. He had gone out at noon to track signs of a cougar that had been stalking local cattle. Eleanor listened for the sound of his horse on the hard-packed road, but the wind drowned every hope of hoofbeats. By sundown, the ranch was wrapped in a hush so deep it made the hairs on her arms rise. She lit the lantern, adjusted the wick, and set it on the windowsill. The flame wavered violently. The sky cracked open with lightning, splitting the world into a moment of blinding white, then plunging it into darkness again. And that's when she heard it, men's voices, slurred, unsteady, getting closer. Eleanor's breath tightened, but she didn't freeze. She lowered the lantern, stepped off the porch, and positioned herself by the front door. Her pulse hammered, but her grip on the lantern's handle stayed firm. The shapes appeared through the storm, a group of drunken ranch hands from town. She recognized two of them from the general store, loudmouths who enjoyed spitting comments as she walked past. Tonight their swagger was worse, fueled by whiskey and the bitter thrill of cruelty. "Well, look at that," one drawled. "The Apache's little bride all alone." Another laughed, a harsh barking sound lost in the wind. "Bet the marriage ain't even real. Bet she sleeps with the door locked." Eleanor didn't step back. She raised the lantern slightly so they could see her face, calm, stern, unflinching. Her heart raced, but she clamped down on the tremor trying to rise in her voice. "You're drunk," she said evenly. "Go home before the storm washes your senses out entirely." The men exchanged amused glances. They weren't used to a woman speaking to them with authority, especially not the old maid they'd mocked for years. "That so?" The first man jeered. "Thought we might pay our respects. See how the Apache's treating you out here." Eleanor held her ground. "He treats me better than any of you know how to treat a woman." The flash of anger in the man's eyes told her she'd hit the mark. He stepped forward. Eleanor didn't retreat. She didn't cower. She didn't even blink. The lantern stayed raised, the flame flickering between her and the advancing men. The storm raged overhead, thunder growling like a warning. And then, OOFBEAT hard, fast. Coming from the west. In the next instant, Taza emerged from the darkness like a shadow given form. Rain streamed off his hair and shoulders. His horse snorted steam into the cold air as he dismounted in one fluid motion. He assessed the situation in a heartbeat. The men, their posture, Eleanor's stance. Something inside him hardened. "Leave," Taza said. One word, low, controlled. The ranch hands shifted, suddenly less brave. The largest one spat into the mud. We're just talking, Apache. No harm done. Thunder cracked again, louder, closer. The storm seemed to lean in to listen. Taza walked forward calmly, placing himself between Eleanor and the men. The way he moved, steady, lethal, the way a mountain lion moves when it decides whether to attack, made even the drunkest of them sober up. "I said," he repeated, "leave." The men exchanged restless glances. They weren't cowards, but neither were they fools. Taza's reputation as a tracker wasn't limited to skilled people whispered that he saw danger before it breathed, that he could fight without raising his voice. Tonight, they saw enough truth in those whispers. The largest man pointed a drunken finger at Eleanor. "You better keep that one in line. She's got a sharp tongue." Taza stepped forward once the smallest movement, but powerful enough to jolt the man backward. The ranch hands cursed under their breath, retreating into the storm, muttering things they didn't dare say aloud. When their figures finally disappeared into the rain, Taza turned to Eleanor. "You should be inside," he said quietly. She met his eyes, breath steady despite the adrenaline roaring through her. "I wasn't going to hide." Her voice wasn't defiant, it was simply true. Thunder rolled above them. The rain became a sheet of silver in the lantern's glow. For a moment, in the storm's fierce light, they studied each other. No walls, no silence, no distance. Taza saw the fear she'd felt, and the strength she'd chosen instead. Eleanor saw the control he carried, and the danger he unleashed only when necessary. Something shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. Not affection. Not yet, but respect, deep, instant, and powerful. Inside the house, when Taza finally sat down his drenched coat and Eleanor dried her shaking hands by the fire, their silence wasn't the old, strained quiet. It was the beginning of a connection neither had expected, a spark born not from romance, but from shared danger, and sparks, once lit, have a way of growing, especially in a place as dry and ready as the Wild West. The morning after the storm, the ranch seemed almost alive. Rain had drenched the dusty earth and small rivulets of water threaded their way down the hills, promising life in a land that had been dry for too long. Eleanor stepped outside, boots sinking into the softened soil, and breathed in the clean, sharp smell of wet earth. The air was heavy with possibility. Taza had returned to his routines, checking traps, scouting for wild game, surveying the hills, but today Eleanor had her own mission. She carried a notebook and a small leather satchel, a remnant of her schoolteacher days, filled with pencils, scrap paper, and plans she had begun sketching in secret. The county had seen the land as failing, dry, barren, and unprofitable, but she saw potential. Life could be coaxed from the soil, water could be redirected, and crops could grow if approached with care and knowledge. She spread her papers across the table in the small kitchen, her hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. The sketches included irrigation channels, crop rotations, and notes on native plants that could stabilize the soil. Her father had been a farmer before her family moved east, and she had inherited both his stubbornness and his understanding of land. She believed she could save the ranch, not just for them, but for the Apache families and settlers who depended on the land's bounty. Taza entered, catching sight of the scattered papers. He paused at the doorway, arms crossed, studying her. Eleanor didn't flinch. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "This land isn't dead. It just needs guidance. I can make it productive again." He raised an eyebrow. "Guidance? From a schoolteacher?" Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't underestimate the mind. I may not be a tracker, but I know how to read soil, how to manage water, how to make things grow, and I want your help." Taza considered her for a long moment, the silence between them growing thick. Finally, he nodded. "Show me." Over the next few weeks, the two worked side by side, their movements becoming synchronized. Eleanor marked the areas where water could be diverted from the small creek, suggested planting patterns that mimic natural growth, and experimented with cover crops to restore nutrients. Taza offered knowledge of the terrain, understanding of local plants, and guidance on reading the weather. Together, they began repairing broken irrigation ditches, clearing stones, and fortifying the soil against erosion. The town watched skeptically. At the general store, whispers followed her like a shadow. "She's trying to be clever with the Apache's land. Dangerous, that. Old Maid thinking she can outsmart nature. He'll soon see she's no use." But Taza's quiet support turned heads. He didn't boast, didn't argue, but by walking beside her in the fields, measuring, digging, and planting, he showed everyone the county had misjudged her. Their partnership was subtle, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Eleanor, for her part, refused to be intimidated. Every obstacle, drought, cracked soil, skeptical neighbors, was met with a plan. She experimented with native grasses that would trap moisture, dug small trenches to channel runoff, and carefully rotated crops to preserve the soil's nutrients. Her mind moved like lightning across calculations, observations, and adjustments. One evening, after a long day of labor, Taza approached her while she inspected a row of newly sprouted beans. "You're stubborn," he said quietly, almost smiling. "I've been called worse," she replied without looking up. He studied her for a moment. The way she stood in the rain-soaked field, dirt on her hands, hair clinging to her face, eyes bright with determination. It was different from anyone he had ever known. There was fire there, yes, but also intelligence, strategy, and resilience. She didn't need him to fight her battles, but she did need him to stand with her, and he did. The county council, once dismissive, could no longer ignore the signs of progress. Small green shoots emerged where before there was only dust. The locals began whispering differently, not of ridicule, but of cautious curiosity. The old maid was making a mark, but even with early success, Eleanor remained focused. She wasn't working for recognition. She was working for results, for life to return to a land everyone else had written off. And with Taza's quiet, steady presence beside her, she began to feel the first faint stirrings of partnership, not only in labor, but in life. Together they were no longer two forced companions. They were a team. A force that the county had underestimated, and a spark that would soon grow into something much greater than either had expected. In that rain-soaked field, with soil beneath her fingernails and Taza's shadow by her side, Eleanor Briggs fed. Days bled into weeks on the ranch, each sunrise bringing more work and, surprisingly, more understanding. Eleanor and Taza moved through the fields with a rhythm that neither of them had consciously planned, yet somehow it fit. She was nimble and thoughtful, able to spot cracks in the soil or weeds among the crops before they became problems. He was methodical and strong, able to lift stones, dig irrigation channels, and read the land with a skill born of years tracking animals and understanding the seasons. Early mornings were spent walking the rows, inspecting sprouts and discussing techniques. Taza would point to a patch of soil and mutter a word in Apache, naming a plant or explaining how the land responded to water. Eleanor took notes in her notebook, sometimes smiling when she found a word that sounded like music on her tongue. He noticed her attention to detail, her ability to see patterns he had overlooked for years. By afternoon, their labor was physical, repairing fences, digging trenches, hauling water from a nearby creek. Eleanor often surprised Taza with her endurance. She didn't complain when her hands blistered or when her boots sank into the mud. She moved with purpose, even when exhaustion tugged at her muscles. Taza respected that. He had never met someone who could keep pace with him and think 3 steps ahead at the same time. Evenings brought their quiet companionship. After long hours of work, they would sit side by side on the porch, wet and dirt-streaked, the sun bleeding red over the horizon. Sometimes Eleanor read aloud from her favorite book stories of faraway places and impossible adventures. Taza listened, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, occasionally asking questions about the characters or the plots. In return, he told her about the land, the animals, the signs of storms, and the hidden paths the settlers rarely noticed. It was in these moments, away from the scrutiny of the townsfolk, that something subtle began to shift between them. The walls of formality and obligation cracked. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by duty. They were partners, equals in labor, in thought, and in patience. Eleanor began to see Taza's humor, dry and understated, his deep respect for the earth, and the gentle precision with which he approached everything. He, in turn, began to notice her courage, her cleverness, and the quiet determination that had surprised him during the stormy night he had rescued her. The town, meanwhile, had begun to murmur in new ways. When Eleanor ventured into the general store with Taza's help to buy seeds or tools, the gossip had changed. Some muttered, "She actually knows what she's doing." Others, begrudgingly, respectful, observed the two of them working together in the fields. The old maid was no longer a joke. She was becoming a force, and her partnership with Taza lent her work legitimacy. There was an unspoken tension as well, quiet awareness of each other's presence that went beyond duty. Taza noticed how Eleanor's eyes sparkled when she found a clever solution to a problem, how her laughter came easily after a day of work, how her hands trembled slightly when she was cold or tired. Eleanor noticed the protective way Taza moved around her, how he instinctively placed himself between her and any potential danger, how his glance could communicate more than words ever could. One evening, as they worked late to finish a new irrigation trench, Eleanor paused, wiping mud from her hands. "I never thought I'd enjoy this," she said, voice soft against the hum of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "I never thought I'd enjoy working with someone else." Taza looked at her, the lamplight flickering over his face. "It's easier," he said quietly, "when the other person knows what they're doing." She smiled, and for a brief, unguarded moment, he caught a glimpse of warmth, curiosity, and perhaps something that hadn't been part of their arrangement. He felt it too, the strange pull of admiration, respect, and the faint beginnings of trust. In those long, muddy, sunburnt days, Eleanor and Taza found themselves learning more than land management. They learned patience, resilience, and the strange intimacy that grows from shared purpose. They spoke little of affection, yet every glance, every shared moment, began to speak volumes. By the time the first shoots of green appeared where only dust had been, they had become something neither of them had expected, companions bound not by duty, but by choice. And though neither would admit it aloud yet, the first seeds of something deeper, something stronger than either had known, were beginning to grow between them, quietly but irreversibly, just like the land they were reviving together. By midsummer, the ranch had begun to transform. Where dust had once cracked the earth, tender green shoots now emerged, their delicate stems trembling in the wind. Corn pushed skyward, beans twisted along the trellis Eleanor had built, and squash sprawled with promising abundance. Even the once barren pasture carried the faint scent of new grass. It was a small miracle, wrought from dirt, sweat, and determination. But not everyone in the county welcomed miracles, especially ones that threatened old power and control. The cattle barons, who had long relied on the drought to maintain dominance. Overgrazing lands noticed the change with growing alarm. A green, thriving field meant competition crop yields that could feed livestock without their control, and the possibility that more settlers and tribes would stake their claim to formerly unusable land. In whispered meetings at the saloon, they fumed, plotting their response. Meanwhile, the council, which had initially forced the marriage to stabilize the region, began to squirm. Rumors reached them that Eleanor was doing more than just managing a farm. She was improving the land, increasing its value, and demonstrating publicly that Taza was capable of more than anyone had credited him. The council feared losing influence. They had assumed the marriage would be a spectacle, a story of obligation and compromise, not a partnership of respect and efficiency. One evening, as Eleanor and Taza returned from checking the irrigation channels, they found a delegation waiting at the gate. 2 councilmen, a lawyer, and one of the cattle barons whose name was whispered with menace. Papers were shoved toward Eleanor. "You've been accused of misappropriating water," the lawyer said, voice flat and precise. "The county has received complaints that you are diverting water illegally, damaging neighboring properties, and interfering with local livestock operations. We are considering action to annul the marriage and seize the land." Eleanor's eyes, tired but sharp from long days in the field, narrowed. She scanned the papers, the accusations, and then the men in front of her. They thought she was fragile. They thought she was powerless. They were wrong. Taza stepped forward, his presence solid behind her. "She has done nothing illegal," he said, voice steady, measured. "The land was barren when she arrived. She has improved it using knowledge and labor. If you come to take it, you will be challenging the truth, not her." The councilmen exchanged uncertain glances. The cattle baron's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, aware that Taza's reputation for both skill and decisiveness could make confrontation costly. Eleanor didn't flinch. She began to lay out her evidence: diagrams of irrigation channels, notes on crop rotation, records of water usage, and even calculations showing how the runoff benefited neighboring lands rather than harming them. She spoke calmly, clearly, each word punctuated by logic, not emotion. Taza stood beside her, occasionally translating her technical explanations into Apache terms when referencing native plants or the land's natural water flow, emphasizing her knowledge and foresight. By the end of their presentation, the councilman had little choice but to reconsider. Even the cattle baron's glare could not hide the grudging respect forming. The papers were withdrawn, though the tension in the air remained taut. Eleanor and Taza had defended their land, but the county had been reminded of their audacity, and that would not be forgotten. That night, the 2 returned to their small house, the glow of the lantern casting long shadows. Eleanor sat at the table, hands folded, eyes tired but alert. Taza poured water into 2 tin cups, offering her one. She accepted it silently. "You stood with me," she said quietly, "even when they tried to turn the county against me." Taza met her gaze, dark eyes unwavering. "I stood with you because it was right, not because they asked it of me, not because it was convenient." Her lips curved in a faint smile. For the first time, Eleanor realized that this forced marriage, once the source of whispered ridicule, had become a partnership forged in fire. Danger, skepticism, and prejudice had tested them, but they had emerged stronger, side by side. Outside, the wind rustled the first leaves of the crops, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Within the small, quiet house, a new kind of calm had settled, a calm born not of relief alone, but of the recognition that they could face any challenge together. The county might still watch, still whisper, still hope for failure, but Eleanor and Taza had discovered a truth more powerful than gossip, suspicion, or prejudice: the strength of unity, respect, and unwavering resolve. And that truth would carry them through the challenges yet to come. Summer arrived in full, scorching and relentless, yet on the Briggs Taza ranch, life had begun to bloom. The once barren fields now bore the fruits of weeks of sweat and planting. Corn stalks stretched tall and straight, Beans climbed neatly along trellises, and squash spread lushly across the ground. Even the native grasses, carefully planted to stabilize the soil, gave the impression of a small, thriving oasis amid a county accustomed to dust and drought. Word of the transformation spread, slowly at first, then more urgently. Townsfolk whispered as they passed the general store. Farmers peeked across fences and murmured among themselves. Cattle barons paced in anger behind closed doors, frustrated by a small woman and an Apache tracker who had defied every expectation. The county council, seeing both risk and opportunity, called a public summer gathering on the town green. It was meant to showcase local achievements and, some councilmen hoped, humiliate Eleanor and Taza. They expected Eleanor to appear awkward, timid, or unprepared, a spectacle to confirm the rumors of the old maid and her unsuitable husband. Eleanor, however, had other plans. With Taza by her side, she arrived early, carrying charts, notes, and a sample of crops harvested from their fields. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as they approached. Murmurs of doubt met the sight of her confident stride. Muddy boots and hair still streaked with soil. The mayor called the gathering to order, expecting Eleanor to fumble or excuse herself. Instead, she began to speak clearly and directly, explaining the transformation of the land, how irrigation channels diverted water efficiently, how native plants protected soil from erosion, how crops had been rotated to maximize nutrition and growth. She spoke not only of techniques but of results, pointing to freshly harvested produce displayed for all to see. Taza stood quietly beside her, a silent testament to the partnership they had forged. He occasionally clarified details, especially regarding the native flora, giving her words weight and authority in a county that often ignored a woman's expertise. Then, she unveiled the centerpiece of their presentation, a small section of land that had been barren, now a patchwork of green fields and thriving vegetables. The crowd gasped. Dusty earth had become living soil. Where before there was only despair and decay, now life flourished under her hands, and with Taza's guidance, a hush fell over the county. The cattle baron's sneers froze. Even the councilmen, who had doubted the wisdom of allowing her initiative, exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor had done what none of them thought possible. The old maid had outsmarted the elements, the skeptics, and the prejudices of an entire community. Then the moment of recognition arrived. Taza extended his hand, taking hers with a gesture of partnership and perhaps pride. The crowd noticed. They saw the Apache tracker and the determined schoolteacher standing together, not bound by duty, but by respect and accomplishment. Their forced marriage had become a union of equals, forged through labor, courage, and intelligence. Whispers rippled through the gathering. She did it? I can't believe it. And he respects her. Eleanor smiled faintly, glancing at Taza. There was no boast, no triumphalism, only quiet satisfaction. They had done more than survive. They had changed the land and, in the process, challenged the county's expectations of both of them. For the first time, the community saw the truth. Appearances could be deceiving. Labels were meaningless, and strength came in many forms. The old maid was no longer a figure of pity or ridicule. She was a woman who had transformed the impossible into reality. And the Apache tracker beside her, once seen as distant and inscrutable, had been her steadfast ally every step of the way. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the plains in deep gold and crimson, Eleanor and Taza had not only demonstrated their capability, but had earned the respect and, in many cases, the awe of the entire county. Even those who had doubted them could not ignore the evidence before their eyes: thriving land, ingenuity, and partnership. That night, back at the ranch, Eleanor walked through the fields one last time before dinner. Taza followed quietly. Neither spoke at first. Words seemed unnecessary. They had faced storms, threats, skepticism, and prejudice, and together they had prevailed. In the quiet, Eleanor realized something profound. This moment, the public recognition, the county's astonishment, the shift in perception was not the climax. It was the beginning of a new chapter. For the land, for the town, and for herself. And when she looked at Taza, dark eyes reflecting the fading light, she understood that their bond had been forged far beyond the expectations of others. Not by obligation, not by gossip, not by fear, but by trust, respect, and shared purpose. The county had been shocked. But Eleanor and Taza knew that the real power was not in the surprise of the crowd, it was in the life they had built together. Quietly and deliberately, on the wild, unforgiving land they now called their own, autumn arrived with a gentle coolness, softening the once relentless summer sun. The fields, once a patchwork of struggling green, were now lush and productive, heavy with ripened crops. Corn stalks rustled in the breeze, squash sprawled proudly, and beans hung thick from their trellises. Even the native grasses, planted to prevent erosion, had rooted firmly, giving the ranch a sense of permanence and life that seemed almost magical to those who had once dismissed it. Eleanor walked through the rows of crops with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Her hands were stained with soil, her dress marked from work, but her posture was proud. She had transformed the land with vision, planning, and hard work, and with Taza by her side, she had done more than improve a ranch. She had rewritten the narrative of what the county believed about her, and about them. Taza walked beside her, silent as always, but his presence spoke volumes. He had been her steadfast partner through storms, both literal and figurative. He had protected her, guided her, and trusted her in ways the county could never have expected. Together, they had endured forced circumstances, skeptical neighbors, and attempts to undermine them. And together, they had thrived. The county's perception had changed dramatically. Word spread of the ranch's success, of Eleanor's ingenuity, and of the partnership that had made it possible. Farmers came to observe, learning her techniques. Cattle barons grumbled quietly but could not ignore the truth. She had created prosperity where none had believed it possible. Councilmen who had doubted her expertise now sought her advice. The whispers of ridicule had faded, replaced by murmurs of respect and, in some cases, admiration. One evening, the mayor of the county himself came to the ranch, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "I have to admit," he said, "I underestimated you both. What you've accomplished here, it's remarkable. You've not only improved the land, but you've changed the way this county thinks about work, partnership, and capability." Eleanor nodded, offering a gracious smile. Taza stood beside her, quiet yet commanding. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers for a moment, an unspoken acknowledgment of everything they had endured and everything they had built. But the true triumph went beyond recognition. It was in the quiet moments at the ranch, sharing the harvest, walking through the fields in the cool autumn light, sitting on the porch and watching the sun dip below the horizon. The forced marriage that had begun as a county decree had grown into a partnership of mutual respect, shared purpose, and a deep, unspoken bond. They had found not only survival, but trust and perhaps even something resembling love. Eleanor, standing in the center of the flourishing fields, felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known. This land, which had seemed barren and hopeless, was alive with possibility. And she, who had once been dismissed as an old maid, had proven herself capable of extraordinary things. The county, the council, and even the skeptics had been forced to acknowledge the truth. She was formidable. Intelligent and resilient, Taza placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. not as a command, not as a reminder of the forced marriage, but as a gesture of partnership. Eleanor looked up at him, their eyes meeting in the fading light, and in that moment, the past, the judgment, the doubt, the whispers fell away. The county had been shocked by their achievements, yes, but the real shock, Eleanor realized, was the transformation of herself and Taza into something stronger together than either could have been alone. They had turned obligation into opportunity, doubt into respect, and survival into triumph. As the harvest moon rose, casting a silvery glow over the fields, Eleanor and Taza stood side by side, surveying what they had created. They didn't need the county's applause, though it was coming in the form of farmers seeking guidance and neighbors pausing to nod in approval. The real acknowledgement was in the quiet certainty that they could face anything together, storms, threats, and even the weight of history itself. The forced marriage that had begun in whispers of ridicule had become a story of courage, ingenuity, and unity. Eleanor Briggs, once dismissed, had seized her destiny. Taza, once merely a tracker and a quiet shadow, had found in her a partner who could match his strength and intellect, determination, and spirit. And so, in the heart of a county that had doubted them both, a new chapter began, not written by others, but claimed through hard work, respect, and unyielding perseverance. The land flourished, the county watched in awe, and Eleanor and Taza finally knew the power of what could be built when two